All right, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for trekking out in the rain today. If you're watching online, good call. My name is David. I am on staff here at Severn, and I'm always happy to see all you guys in person here. And really today, have really one main announcement. We've been talking about this for the past few weeks, but here at Severn, we really want to be a community of people who are growing together in authentic, Jesus-centered relationships, and our small groups are really the primary way that we make that available and that we kind of put it on our calendars and take an effort to really get to know each other beyond the Sunday morning gathering. And we've had signups going for the past couple weeks. I'm out there again doing signups today. And I just wanted to say that the semester officially started last week, but with our small groups, it's really never too late to join one. So you can join one. Right now is obviously a great time because it's the beginning of a semester, but you can always join middle of the semester, even towards the end, and kind of get like a trial run of a group. And we've been having different small group leaders up here with me the past few weeks. And this week I have Jeff and Carla Coleman. They lead one of our groups that is family-based. If you have kids, it's a great group to go to, but even if you don't, it works as well. And they're going to tell you a little bit about their group.
Good morning, everybody. We have been hosting our small group for about 3 years now, and it's been a great time to get together with other families just to pray together and talk about what we're learning. And the layout of our house makes it easy for us to kind of get together for a meal and then send the kids down to the basement to play while we can have some connection time with just the adults. So.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Dave said about getting connected. So we've been in the Army for 28 years, and we've moved over 10 times. And so I think there's no better way to get connected than to be involved in a small group of believers who share common values, similar place in life. Like Carla said, we have kids. They come, we eat a meal together. The kids hang out while the parents do the Bible study, and it's a great way just to do life on life with each other. So if you've not been in one or you're looking for one, we'd love to have you. We do ours on Tuesday nights.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff and Carla. And really awesome family. Me and my wife had actually considered going to their group, but I think the time didn't work or something. So, but would definitely recommend that group. And really any of our groups, if you have questions, I'll be out there. Again, if you can't find a group that works for you, please mention that. We can always start a new group or at least make a list of people who can't find one so we know where our gaps are. It always helps us out knowing who's having a hard time connecting. So appreciate you guys being here, and let's go ahead and worship.
Good morning, everyone. It's all great to see you. Let's all just stand and we're just going to worship God together this morning.
Now the darkness fades into new beginnings as we lift our eyes to a hope beyond. All creation waits with an expectation to declare the reign of the Lord our God. We will not be moved when the earth gives way, for the risen one has overcome. For every fear, there's an empty grave, for the risen one has overcome. Now the silence breaks in the name of Jesus, as the heavens cry, let the earth respond. All creation shouts with a voice of triumph to declare the reign of the Lord our God. We will not be moved when the earth gives way, for the risen one has overcome. And for every fear, there's an empty grave, for the risen one is overcome. shall reign forever. Strongholds now surrender, for the Lord our God has overcome. Who can be against us? Jesus, our defender, he is Lord, and he has overcome. He shall reign forever. Strongholds now surrender, for the Lord our God has overcome. Who can be against us? Jesus, our defender, he is Lord, and he has overcome. We will not be moved when the earth gives way, for the risen one has overcome. And for every fear there's an empty grave, for the risen one has overcome. We will not be moved when the earth gives way, for the risen one has overcome. And for every fear there's an empty grave, for the risen one has overcome.
I cast my mind to Calvary, where Jesus bled and died for me. I see his wounds, his hands, his feet, my Savior, that cursed tree. His body bound and drenched in tears, they laid him down in Joseph's tomb. The entrance sealed by heavy soul, Messiah still and all alone. transfixed on Jesus' face. Sing, oh praise. Oh, praise the name of the Lord again. Oh, praise His name forevermore. For endless days we will sing Your praise. Oh Lord, our God. Oh, praise the name of the Lord again. Oh, praise His name forevermore. For endless days we will sing Your praise. Oh Lord, our God. Oh Lord, our God again. Oh Lord, our Lord again. Yes, Lord Jesus. Yes. Grander earth is wake before, moved by the sound of His voice, and seas that are shaken and stirred can be calmed and broken from my regard. Through it all, my eyes are on You. And through it all, it is well. And through it all, my eyes are on You, and it is well with me. Far be it from me to not believe, even when my eyes can't see. And this mountain that's in front of me will be thrown into the midst of the sea. And through it all, my eyes are on You. And through it all, it is well. And through it all, my eyes are on You, and it is well.
Amen. Thank you, worship team. Morning, everybody. Thank you for making it out today. Almost had to build a boat. And everybody joining us online, thank you for taking the time. This is a great week if you're hopping in for the first time or kind of joining us for the first time in a while. This is a great week to be hopping in because this weekend we're beginning a brand new series that's going to take us all the way through the fall. It's going to butt right up to an Advent series that we're going to end the year with. And for this series, we are going to walk through the book of James, which, if you know anything about James, it is largely considered to be the most practical book in the New Testament, if not the entire Bible. And what James does, verse after verse, passage after passage, is show you and I how a relationship with Jesus applies to everyday situations that we're all going to face all throughout our lives. And so for the next 12 weeks, James is going to explain to us things like how to handle trials, how to grow spiritually, how to get better at relationships, what it means to treat people fairly with both justice and mercy, how to stop worrying, the dangers of materialism, literally everything that we're all going to experience all throughout our lives. And so on the front end of this series, I just want to cordially invite you to lean in and allow the book of James to tell you how faith works. You like that? Pretty grabby? So let me read the first major section of the book of James. It's all dealing with one specific topic. It's found in James chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. So let me go ahead and read that entirely on the front end of our time together. It says, James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. Consider it a great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. But endurance must do its complete work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. Now, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and without criticizing, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith without doubting, for the doubter is like the surging sea, driven and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. An indecisive man is unstable in all his ways. The brother of humble circumstances should boast in his exaltation, but the one who's rich should boast in his humiliation, because he will pass away like a flower of the field. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and dries up the grass, its flower falls off, and its beautiful appearance is destroyed. In the same way, the rich man will wither away while pursuing his activities. A man who endures trials is blessed, because when he passes the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. No one undergoing a trial should say, I am being tempted by God, for God is not tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when he's drawn away and enticed by his own evil desires. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dearly loved brothers. Every generous act and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. With him there is no variation or shadow cast by turning. By his own choice, he gave us a new birth by the message of truth, so that we would be the first fruits of his creatures. This is God's word. There is a whole lot going on in this passage. I actually taught through James. It was the first sermon series I did when I became the pastor here. It was all the way back in the fall of 2014, and I was kind of reflecting back on that series while I was putting this together. And I believe I spent 5, maybe 6 weeks in chapter 1 alone. When we went through it the first time. So this is a huge block of text that has a lot of moving parts, and we could spend a lot of time here, but the truth is that this opening passage that I just read to you, it really is singularly about one topic, and that topic is trials. And the fact that James gets to this topic as quickly and seemingly abruptly as he does tells us that when the Holy Spirit inspired him to write it, he evidently thought that this was a topic of the utmost importance for the original recipients of this letter. We can sort of gather from James's tone here and the content here that the people that he was writing to were going through a lot of trials and were at least at risk of not going through those trials well. But I want to offer you something. This is a bold thing to say, but if you give me a few minutes, I think I can prove it, that as important as it was for the original recipients of this letter to hear how to go through trials well, as important as that evidently was for them, I think if anything, it's actually more important for us because, bold statement to make here, we as a society, there has never been a society in human history more unprepared for trials than the society we live in now. It's a bold statement to make, but I think I can prove that if you give me a few minutes here. The reason that I say that is because we are the first secular society in human history. So you hear me talk a lot about the differences between Christianity and every other major belief system, but if I can for just a moment here, talk about what they have in common. One thing that Christianity has in common with every other major belief system is this idea that there are two worlds or two lives. There's the world that we live in, and then there's the world to come. Every society in human history prior to ours has been built on a belief system that taught that this world is not all that there is. That this life is full of pain and brokenness and frustration and dissatisfaction. There's something wrong here, but there's a life after this, and that is the life of happiness, or at least it can be the life of happiness and bliss and peace and joy, and the one where our wildest dreams will come true. Obviously, every belief system differs about what exactly that life is that comes after this and how you have to live to get to that next life. But what every society has had in common is this idea is that there's more to existence than just this very short life that we have now. And so for all of those other human societies, what they've all understood is that the purpose of life is not to be happy. That would have sounded ridiculous to them. They knew that the purpose of life was to live this life in line with the values of the next life. So you go back across literally every human society, and you'll see that they believed the purpose of life was to be wise or strong or courageous or self-sacrificing or brave or whatever it is, to live this life in line with the values of the world to come, because this life is a fleeting thing. It's a shadow, whereas the next life is eternal. It's lasting. Secularism, kind of in the face of that, teaches that this life is all there is, which is actually a new idea. You know, the belief system that we refer to as secularism is this idea that you got here purely by natural causes. You evolved with no kind of grand design behind you, and so you get one life. You have no idea how long that life is, but when it's over, there's nothing after this. Your body decays. You kind of just feed the flora and the fauna. It's something like the circle of life taught in The Lion King. And so what that means is that you're living in the very first society in human history that's built on the idea that there is only one life, only one world. And so what secularism has done is it's created a society that believes something that no society in human history has ever believed, which is that the purpose of life is to be happy. That this life is all you get, so if you're going to experience happiness or peace or joy or bliss, you better get it in this life because you have no opportunity for that after this. So secularism has created this society that believes the purpose of life is to be happy, and that's had a twofold effect on us. The first is secularism has created a society that is more unhappy than the people who have come before us. Countless studies, even non-religious studies, you can see this in places like Forbes magazine, bear this out, that in our secular society, it's now filled with people who are quantifiably more unhappy than their ancestors. We're more stressed, we're more anxious, we're more depressed, we're less satisfied than the people that came before us, because we're asking this world to give us something that it can't give us. But right along with that, what secularism has also done is it's created a society that is more unprepared for trials than any society that's come before us. Because if you just think about it, secularism offers no resources to somebody who's dealing with suffering or pain or heartache or hurt or loss. We are more unprepared for trials than any society that's come before us. And you might hear that and say, okay, but I'm not a secular person. You might hear what I'm saying and say, well, that's fine, but I believe the Bible. I believe that God one day will renew all of creation, and that those who give their life to Jesus will be physically raised, given a new body as Jesus was raised. And that's great. Obviously, I believe that too. But as people who live in a secular society, we'd be foolish to not at least entertain the idea that we're more influenced by the society around us than we think. And so my point in saying all that is very simply that we are more unprepared for trials, if anything, than the people James originally wrote this letter to. And so the opening verses of James, what they're designed to do is not only get us ready for trials and not only get us through trials, but he says it right here in verse 2, but get us to the point where the trials that we experience in this life have no power over us except to produce joy in us. And so I say all that to say, if you're here this morning and you have too much joy in your life, you're trying to offload some of that because you can't handle any more of being you, you're just too happy, then I apologize for wasting your time. But if you realize, like me, that you don't perfectly navigate the trials of your life, and that you would love to become the kind of person who, when life falls apart, it actually has this kind of opposite effect in you, that it somehow, when life gets harder, you become more joyful, more internally strong, more buoyant, more hopeful. If that's something you desire for you, then this teaching is for you, because that's exactly what these verses are about. And according to James, if we want to get to the point where the trials of life have no power over us except to produce joy in us, there's three things that we need to understand. You see all three of these ideas in the opening verses of James, and it's going to serve as the talking points today. We're going to talk about, number one, we need to understand the nature of trials. Number two, the potential of trials. And number three, the resources needed for transforming all of our trials. And so those three ideas will basically serve as the moves of today's teaching. So first off, let's talk about the nature of trials. Very first thing James says here, after his extraordinarily brief introduction, verse 2, very famous verse, he says, "Consider it a great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials." Now, there's just two things that I want to point out here about the nature of trials. One will be very obvious to you. One I've definitely known my whole life. But the second one has only become clear to me this week, even though I've been pretty familiar with the message of James my whole life. First off, James says that trials are a guarantee in your and my life, because if you notice here, he does not say consider it joy if you experience them. He says consider it joy when you experience them. That idea, as simple as it is valuable, and it's worth spending time on a Sunday morning, because as much as we know the opposite to be true, as much as we know better, there is a belief buried deep in every human heart that tells us that if we live a good life, so long as we live a pretty good life, God will give us a good life. And yeah, we might experience frustration and those kind of things, but God would not let any of the really bad stuff happen to us. I'm just going to speak personally here. I know what the book of Job teaches. I know that more than half of the Psalms are called Psalms of lament or Psalms of mourning, Psalms birthed from a place of deep pain. I know that Jesus Christ, who lived a perfect life, was called a man of sorrows. And I know that history teaches that 11 of the 12 apostles, that's men that were more devoted to Jesus Christ than I ever hoped to be, died for their faith. Even though I know all of that with my mind, I still sense and deal with in my own heart this nagging belief that God would never let any of that really terrible stuff happen to me. And that idea, really more than anything else, is what makes our trials so unbearable. Because then what happens when we find ourselves in the midst of something where we feel like we're in over our head, then what happens is we're trying to grieve two losses at the same time. On the one hand, we're experiencing grief because of the actual trial that we're dealing with and the pain and the difficulty and the loss involved therein. But then underneath that, we're also dealing with this grieving process of the fact that we're going through a trial at all. You know, it's not even the trial itself, it's the fact that we're dealing with this when, you know, we've lived such a good life. And when that happens, you tend to vacillate between, you know, being angry at yourself because you must have done something to deserve this, or angry at God because you've lived a good life and he owes you a better life than this. So you kind of go between the two ends of I hate me or I hate thee. And you can't deal, the human heart can't bear up under that. It's hard enough to just deal with the trials of life, but when you're dealing with low-grade bitterness and resentment underneath that, that's a formula for basically bringing us to the end of ourselves very quickly. And so the very first idea that James is going at in his letter is that idea where he tells us when it comes to trials, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Now that, I'm sure, you've heard before, that no matter how good of a life you live, you know, you should expect this kind of thing. But the second idea that I see here that I've never seen before in James until this week, he says that your trials will be various. Now that not only means that you will experience more than one trial in your life, it means that you will experience more than one kind of trial in your life. And according to the Bible, I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, not all trials are created equal. In other words, trials obviously are going to come with different degrees of severity. Lived experiences teaches us that. But in addition to that, different trials in your and my life will aim at different parts of you. They'll test different parts of you. They'll come from different parts of you. And in these opening verses, James lays out at least 4 of the kinds of trials that you and I should expect in our lives. And there's a good chance that no matter where you're coming from this morning, you are right now at present dealing with one of these 4 kinds of trials. And maybe until this moment, you didn't even realize what it was that you're going through. So let me walk through this. 4 different kinds of trials according to these opening verses. First off, James talks about a kind of trial that specifically tests your faith. Let me read verses 2 and 3. He says, "Consider it a great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials," verse 3, "knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance." So you notice the parallel that's drawn there. James talks about a trial and a testing of your faith. So what he's talking about here is a kind of trial that specifically tests your faith. This is a trial that will reveal functionally what it is that you've placed your faith in. Now, the implication there is that it's entirely possible for you and I to move through life thinking that our faith is in God when actually it's not. And the only way for God to reveal that to you and I is by leading us through a trial like this. So here's an example of how this works out. A lot of times, you hear stories of people who will say something like, "Yeah, I used to believe in God. I used to have faith in God. I used to read my Bible and pray and go to church. I used to be a person of faith." But then they went through some profound amount of difficulty where they lost something that was very precious to them. And so because of that, they walked away. A lot of people would describe a story like that as walking away from the faith. James, however, would not. James would say that person did not walk away from the faith. What happened is they experienced a trial that revealed where their faith actually was, and their faith was never in God. And what that trial revealed is that the real thing that they were looking to for their sense of worth, the real thing that they were looking to give their life meaning, the real thing that they were looking to make them happy, God allowed them to lose that thing. And that was what they actually had their faith in. God was never anything more than a means to that end. And so when that thing was taken away, they walked out on God. And so what James is describing here, trials like that are trials of faith because they test what your faith is actually in. Secondly, James talks about a kind of trial, but not a trial that primarily goes at your faith as much as it goes at your wisdom. You see this in verse 5. He says, "Now, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and without criticizing, and it will be given to him." If you read these opening verses just through in one sitting, verse 5 kind of seems like it came out of nowhere. Like James was talking about trials, and now he's all of a sudden talking about wisdom. The truth is, James has not changed the subject in verse 5. He's still talking about trials. The difference is now he's talking about a trial that tests your wisdom, one that requires more wisdom than you currently have. So to understand this kind of trial, you have to understand what the Bible is talking about when it refers to wisdom. And I read this definition a long time ago. A German theologian by the name of Gerhard von Rad, he put it best when he said, you can summarize all that the Bible's talking about when it talks about wisdom with this concept of competency regarding the complex realities of life. Whenever the Bible talks about wisdom, that's what it's talking about. So your life, of course, there's no way to prove this, but I think probably on average, you'd agree with this, about 85% of your life is filled with situations that, as much as we would love it, it's not black and white. It's not clear cut. There's no Bible verse to point to. There's no morally right and morally wrong answer. What you're presented with is a situation in which there's a wise and a whole bunch of really unwise answers. But maybe 80% of life is like that. Things like, should you remain single or get married? And if so, who should you marry? Should you go to college or should you join the military or should you enter the workforce? And if so, then what lane do you take? Those don't have morally right and morally wrong options. They just have wise and very unwise options. Biblically speaking, a person with wisdom is a person who understands how the world works, and so they know how to skillfully navigate all of these situations in which the moral rules don't directly apply, and there isn't a specific Bible verse you can point to tell you what to do. And so with that in mind, a trial that James is talking about here, a trial that tests your wisdom, is a situation in life God walks you through that exceeds your present understanding of how the world works. It's a situation in life that confounds your understanding. It's disorienting, and it either breaks you or it forces you to recalibrate and rethink what you thought you knew. So here's a great example of this. Maybe, this is a really common one, maybe you were going through life and without even realizing it, you kind of had this low-grade belief that as long as you do your best to live a life that honors God, and you seek Him in His Word, and you pray to Him, and you go to Him first in all things, then God will make sure that your plans for your life work out the way that you hope that they would, and yet you found yourself in a situation in life where you've experienced the opposite. In other words, what's happened is you found out that life does not work the way that you thought it did. James would say, when you're in a situation like that, you are in a trial, in the midst of a trial that specifically tests not as much your faith as much as your wisdom. Thirdly, what James talks about here is what I'm going to call, and hopefully you'll understand why I call it this, trials of extremes. You read about this in verses 9 and 10, where it says, "The brother of humble circumstances should boast in his exaltation, but the one who's rich should boast in his humiliation, because he will pass away like a flower of the field." Now, what James is doing here is talking about two different people in two different situations who find themselves on either end of the spectrum of life. All right, the first one is what he calls, at least my version translates, the brother of humble circumstances. That whole English phrase is pulled from just one singular Greek word. And the word that James uses here, I looked up the definition of it this week, it literally means not rising far from the ground. And so James is talking about, on the one hand, a person experiencing profound adversity. This is a person who maybe they had a financial reversal in their life. Maybe they lost their career. Maybe they lost a relationship. Maybe they lost their reputation. Maybe they lost their health. Maybe they lost somebody that they loved. The point is, things in their life have not worked out the way that they hoped they would, and they've been brought low to a place where literally they're not rising far from the ground. The other person that James talks about here in verse 10 is a person who's rich, or literally abounding. This is a person, obviously, who has everything going for him. A person that wakes up one day and looks around and realizes, I don't really have any major problems, I got a pretty good life. In the context of this passage, I think this is pretty profound, actually. James is saying that both people in both of those situations in life are in the midst of a trial. This means that whether you're in a position right now of adversity or prosperity, according to the Word of God, whether you realize it or not, God is walking you through a trial. And what James is saying is a direct nod to a very famous prayer you may or may not be familiar with that comes out of Proverbs chapter 30, verses 8 and 9, which says, give me, I think this is one of my favorite prayers in all the Bible. It says, give me neither poverty nor wealth. Feed me with the food I need. And here's why, verse 9. Otherwise, I might have too much and deny you, saying, who is the Lord? Or I might have nothing and steal, profaning the name of my God. That's a prayer written by a man named Agur, who understood that life at both ends of the spectrum, whether it's poverty or riches, whether it's failure or success, whether it's adversity or prosperity, both of those situations are equally dangerous for human beings for different reasons. Because in extreme adversity, the great temptation we're faced with is to take matters into our own hands, believing that God is no longer caring for us. Whereas in great prosperity, the temptation is to forget about God altogether, forgetting that we need Him and desperately depend on Him. That's what James is talking about here, a trial of the extremes of life. But fourthly, and this will be the last one before we move on, James talks about a kind of trial that we usually just refer to as a temptation, but James is explicit, it's actually a trial. Verses 13 to 15. It says, no one undergoing a trial should say, I am being tempted by God, for God is not tempted by evil, and He Himself does not tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when he's drawn away and enticed by his own evil desires. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. And so what James is talking about here is a situation in life in which you're enticed by your own desires. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it's a shame that my version of the Bible calls it evil desires, because that's not what the Greek word that James uses means. The Greek word is epithumia, and literally what it means is an over-desire. So what James is talking about here, it can be a desire for something that God explicitly says is bad, but more often than not, what it is it's an over-desire, an inappropriately strong desire, even for things in life that are good. According to the Bible, most of what we call sin is born not from a desire for something bad, but for an over-desire and an inordinate desire for something good, something like a reputation or a career or romantic love or comfort or security or money or all of those things that aren't bad in and of themselves, but according to the Bible, those things cease to be a devil only when they cease to be our God. So what James is talking about here, lastly, is a trial that finds its origin not in the circumstances of life outside of you, but within your own heart. Now, personally, I don't think James meant for these opening verses to be an exhaustive list of every kind of trial we're going to experience in this life. However, the more that I sat on this week, I couldn't notice how all-encompassing this is. So just to recap here before we move on, James is talking about, first off, a trial that tests your faith. That deals with your heart. Then a trial that tests your wisdom. That deals with your understanding. Then he talks about trials that find their origin outside of you in your circumstance or situation in life. And then lastly, trials that have to do with the desires inside your own heart. I think it's safe to say that every difficulty you and I find ourselves dealing with in life is going to somehow fit into one of those four categories. And so the point is, the very first message James offers us is that we should expect our lives to be literally filled with trials that come in all shapes and sizes. And the more I thought about that, I thought if we could just hang on to that idea by itself, that alone would create so much more resiliency in our lives. And I'll just speak for myself personally here. If I could wake up tomorrow morning and the first thought in my mind being the expectation that I will experience a testing today that will either test my faith or test my wisdom, show me how little I really understand about the way God's designed the world, or experience a test that comes from outside of me or inside of me, that alone, if we could hold on to it, would create a lot more resilience in us. Now that alone, while it might be a helpful idea, it's not a terribly comforting idea, that life is going to be full of trials. And so the second thing that James talks about here is not just the nature of trials, but the potential of trials. So let me go back to verse 2, and we'll read verses 3 and 4 after it. He says, "Consider it a great joy, my brothers, when you experience various trials. Here's why we should consider it a great joy. Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. But endurance must do its complete work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing." So what James is saying here is that if God never allowed trials in your and my life, what would happen is we would remain perpetually incomplete people. Because, according to the Word of God, you find this here and you find this a lot of other places in the New Testament, the writings of Peter and Paul, what this is saying is that trials have the potential to bring things into your and my life that only a trial can bring into our lives. And this passage is literally littered with what those things are. I mean, you see it right here. Trials can bring endurance into our lives, maturity, they can bring wholeness, they can bring wisdom, they can bring stability, they can create in us a freedom where we're no longer controlled and kind of dictated by our surrounding circumstances. And then in verse 12, he told us that if we endure trials, God will give us the crown of life. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't even exactly know what that is, but it sounds pretty good. I don't think anybody's going to try to return the crown of life that God offers to them. But here's the point of this, and this is maybe the most important underlying assumption of these opening 18 verses in James. Trials don't do this automatically. Trials do not develop anybody by default. If they did, then James wouldn't see the need to speak to them at all. There would be no need to do that. And I think lived experiences teaches you and I that. We all know people, or maybe we see this in our own lives, we know people that have gone through incredible difficulty, and they're not better, they're bitter. They're more self-pitying. They're more self-centered. They're more angry. They're more callous. They're more incapable of love and service and compassion and mercy and opening up their lives to other people. There's a lot of people that go through trials and are not better off for it. So the question is, how can you and I make sure that we will be? And to answer that question, I'm going to look at lastly, what James points to as the resources that we need in our trials. And all those resources are found in the final 3 verses of this section. Verses 16 through 18 read, "Don't be deceived, my dearly loved brothers. Every generous act and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. With him there is no variation or shadow cast by turning. By his own choice, he gave us a new birth by the message of truth, so that we would be the first fruits of his creatures." So let me just ask before we walk through this, does it not seem strange that James says this, what I just read to you, after talking about trials for 15 verses? Because up until this, it's been very explicitly about the trials of life. James says, count it joy when you face trials. He says, let your trials grow you. He says, ask for wisdom when you face trials, whether you're in a high place or a low place. You're dealing with trials when you have desires in your own heart at war against God's will for your life. You're experiencing trials. And then at the end of this, seemingly out of nowhere, he says, by the way, don't be deceived. Perfect gifts come from God who gave us new birth. And then after this, after verse 18, he completely switches gears and he begins a new topic in verse 19 that we're going to get into next week. So this is the end. This is the finale of this opening section that's all about how to handle trials in your life. I read a number of commentaries this week, and even the commentaries admitted that it's not immediately, abundantly clear what these last 3 verses have to do with the 15 verses that came before. But if you zoom out, here's what's happening here. Right after James talks about trials, telling us to have joy in them, to let those trials grow us. Right after that, he gives us 3 verses. And the reason for that is because the key to transforming your and my trials so that they have no power over us except to produce joy in us, the entire secret for doing that is found in what James says in these final 3 verses. So let me break them into 2 parts for us. And I don't want to overstate the point here, but I do want to be clear. If you miss this last part, because we're at the final move of this teaching, if you miss what's said here, this was in no uncertain terms a complete waste of your time. Let me look at verses 16 and 17 first. He says, "Don't be deceived, my dearly loved brothers. Every generous act and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. With him, there's no variation or shadow cast by turning." When James says, and different versions translate this differently, when James talks about every generous act and every perfect gift, that's James's way of basically talking about everything that you find beautiful in this life. Everything that brings you every measure of joy is what James would call the generous acts and the perfect gifts of life. So here's what he's saying here. Don't miss this in verse 17. James is saying, behind everything in this life that you and I find beautiful, behind everything in this life that we find meaningful, behind everything in this life that brings us any measure of joy, behind all of that, and the source of all of that, is a God that he calls the Father of lights, who made you and I, that you and I are made to know. So what this means is that if you think that his acts and his gifts are great, wait till you meet him. Because the most perfect gift that you and I experience in this life does little more than barely speak whispers of how great and how beautiful and how majestic and how awesome and how perfect and how holy the giver of all these gifts actually is. Now, you read this in context, and what James is saying here is the key to handling the trials of life is holding on to that truth. That behind everything in this life that brings you joy is a God who's infinitely greater than the gifts that he gives. The key, and let me say that one more time, the key to handling all of the trials of life is hanging on to that truth. Let's ask the question, why? What is the greatness of God? The source of all joy, what does that have to do with you and I dealing with whatever we're dealing with Monday morning? Here's why. This is so logical to me. What every single trial that you and I go through in this life has in common, what every trial, no matter what degree it is, whether it deals with your faith, your wisdom, it's coming from outside of you or inside of you, what all trials have in common is they have the power to take away a good gift. That's what makes a trial a trial. They take something away that we consider good. Whether that's a job, your health, your wealth, your reputation, somebody that you love. That's what trials do. Trials are trials because they either threaten or they take away a good gift in this life. But what no trial will ever have the power to do is take away the one who gave you those gifts. And so the point here is that if you and I make God, who James calls the Father of lights, the source of the light that we see just glimpses of in this life, if you and I make God, the giver of all those gifts, the source and origin of all joy, if we make him our highest joy, then what happens when we do that and as we do that is our trials lose the power to break us. They lose the power to upend us. They lose the power to create despondency in us. And actually, not only do they lose that power, but they now only have the power to produce more joy in us. And so what this is about in verse 17, it's about learning how to treasure God above all else in this life. The question is, how do we do that? The answer is, we can't. Let's close in prayer. No, let me draw your attention back to verse 16. I thought this was so fascinating. You notice before James talks about God being the Father of lights, verse 16 almost seems like a throwaway verse where he says, don't be deceived. You ask yourself, why does James, before telling us that God is behind everything that we love in this life, you know why James says don't be deceived? Because we all are deceived, and we've been deceived since Genesis chapter 3. What we have been doing since the day sin entered the world and we walked out on God is we've been giving our hearts to the gifts and forgetting about the author of those gifts. We've been deceived. We've been worshiping, according to Paul in Romans chapter 1, we've been worshiping and serving the creation rather than the Creator. And that, more than anything else, is the ultimate source of all of the pain and all of the turmoil and all of the hurt that mankind as a race has caused itself. But here's the problem. We can't just decide to change that. I can stand up on stage every Sunday and say, love God more than you used to, make him your highest joy, see in 7 days, gang. It's not going to do anybody any good. And this right here is where, to my knowledge, every belief system other than Christianity leaves you with something that you have to do that really you can't do if you think about it long enough. Only Christianity goes a step further than that. Instead of leaving us with something that we have to do, leaves us telling us what God has done for us that enables us and empowers us to do what he's called us to do. And it's found in verse 18. Verse 18 says, by his own choice, he being God. This is the Father of lights, who's the source and origin of everything that brings us joy in this life. James says, by his own choice, he gave us a new birth by the message of truth so that we would be the first fruits of his creatures. You hear me speak a lot against, formulas and techniques and things like that. If I can walk that back for 1 second, I want to say something that might sound strange here. If there is in the entire Bible, if there is a formula for falling more in love with God, for loving him the way that he deserves more and more throughout your life, for making him your highest joy, the way that James calls us to, if there's a formula for getting better at that all throughout your life, it's found in what James says in verse 18. If you and I want to make God our highest joy more and more so that our trials have no power over us except to produce joy in us, we have to understand what he's telling us God has done for us in verse 18. It boils down to 3 things. James says, first off, that God chose you by his own choice. Secondly, he says that he made you new. He gave us a new birth. And thirdly, he's done this at the infinite cost of his own son, Jesus, because he says he's done this by the message of truth. That's the gospel, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so I'll make this as clear as I can before we close today, that if you and I want to grow more into people that are able to withstand the trials of life and become more joyful and buoyant throughout those trials, it boils down to all throughout our lives driving these 3 key ideas deeper and deeper into our hearts. Number 1, James says you have to remember that God chose you, that you did not make yourself attractive or appealing to him, that the source of his love, it finds its origin in his heart, not in what's in your heart. It depends on what is in his heart, not on what's in yours. He chose you. Secondly, James says you have to remember that he made you new. That in Jesus, you have become what James calls a first fruit of his creation. That means the moment that you give your life to Jesus, the divine nature of God enters into your being, and a healing has begun in you that when it's complete will one day completely rid you of the horrible, corrupting power of this thing called sin, and you will stand a new creation in a creation that's made completely new. And lastly, James says you have to remember that the way that God has done this, the way that he makes you and I new, is at the infinite cost of his own son, Jesus. Paul said in Romans chapter 8, verse 32, he who did not spare his own son, but freely gave him for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? If we're to love God more deeply throughout our lives, it boils down to reminding ourselves throughout our lives how perfectly he's loved us. And it makes perfect sense to me that God would deliver all of this to us through a man named James. We're almost done today. This will be the last thing I wanted to walk us through. This week, I learned a lot about James's story. First off, there's a number of Jameses mentioned in the New Testament, but the James that authored this letter is James, who is the brother of Jesus. And what we know about James is that it took him a while for him to figure out who Jesus was and to really call him Lord and to worship him, because in John's gospel account, chapter 7, verse 5, we're told that Jesus' own brothers, including James, did not believe Jesus' claim to divinity. They mocked him, they ridiculed him, they publicly dishonored him. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 7, we're told something really fascinating. After Jesus was raised from the dead, he appeared to hundreds, if not thousands of people. And when Jesus would do that, he almost always appeared to groups. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 7, we're told that James, the brother of Jesus, was one of very few people who were given the distinct honor and privilege of a one-on-one meeting with the resurrected Messiah. And all I can say is, oh, to be a fly on the wall during that conversation. We have no idea what Jesus actually said to James. What we do know is that whatever it was, it completely changed James's life forever. Because he went on not only to be a follower of Jesus Christ, but he was a leader in the church in Jerusalem when the early church was getting off the ground and taking its very first steps. And James, we're told from extra biblical accounts, was not only a leader in his life, he was a leader in his death. In AD 62, enemies of the gospel took James by force to the pinnacle of the temple. And they commanded James specifically to command people to stop coming to Jesus, to stop putting their trust in Jesus as God. And it makes perfect sense to me that they specifically wanted James to publicly denounce Jesus. Not just because James was a leader in the church, but because James was, like I said, the brother of Jesus Christ. You think about it. If anybody could have told the world what Jesus was really like behind closed doors, it was James. If anybody could have stood on a pedestal and said, listen, you're all deceived. I saw him like you haven't seen him. Let me tell you how wrong you are about him. It's James. And yet James here in the opening verses of this epistle named Jesus Christ Lord. To me, this is one of the greatest apologetics for the truth of Christianity. Can I just ask you for a moment, what would you have to do to convince your siblings that you were God? Jesus did that. Jesus, evidently his life was so beautiful, it was so sinless, it was so flawless, that James, the brother of Jesus Christ, worshiped his own half-brother as God made flesh. So these religious leaders took James to the pinnacle of the temple. They commanded him to tell people, stop turning to Jesus. James refused, and so they threw him from the top of the temple. That fall, while it broke James's body, it did not kill him. And so we're told that James, in his final breaths, using all of his strength, he brought himself to his knees, and he did exactly the same thing that he saw his brother Jesus do on the cross in his final moments. He prayed for the forgiveness of his murderers. And as he did, they stoned him to death, and they beat him over the head with a fuller's bat until he stood before his brother in paradise. Now, that question 2,000 years ago to the onlookers begs the same question that it begs today, which is, how on earth do you explain that? How does somebody walk through that kind of injustice, having their life cut short, stolen from them? How does somebody go through a trial of that severity and that magnitude with that kind of joy, to the point that they're actually loving and praying for the forgiveness and the salvation of their murderers? And the only way to explain that is that James believed, what the Holy Spirit inspired him to write in James chapter 1, verse 18. He knew that whatever God walked him through, three things were always true: that God chose him, that God made him new, and he did it by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what his life, in his life and in his death shows us is that when that truth becomes more real to us, then our trials have no power over us but to produce joy in us. Why, you ask? That's just how faith works. So I want to call the worship team up today, and we're going to end today's teaching and begin this series reminding ourselves of what God has done for us in Jesus by celebrating communion. So we're going to have one final song. At the end of that song, I'll come back and we'll take communion together. But during this song, you're invited to approach the table closest to you, to take the bread, to take the juice, to take it back to your seat, and to take some time dealing with God and allowing God to deal with you. Regardless of the details of your life, and maybe you and God are the only one that knows them, I'm confident that every person listening to this teaching is dealing with a trial today. Maybe what you're walking through is a test of your faith. Maybe it's a test of your wisdom. Maybe your trial has more to do with what's going on outside of you, or maybe your trial finds its origin with what's going on inside of your own heart. The point is, whatever it is that God's walking you through this morning or this period of time in your life, what James would say to you if he were alive today is that if you want to walk through that trial in a way that will produce more joy in you, the key is right here, right now, to make God your highest joy, your greatest love, by remembering what he's done for you in Jesus. That's what we remember as we celebrate communion. Let's do it.
In the quiet, in the stillness, I know that you are God. In the secret of your presence, I know there I am restored. There is no one else for me, none but Jesus, crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring him praise. In the chaos, in confusion, I know you're sovereign still. Oh, in the moment of my weakness, you give me grace to do your will. So when you call, I won't delay. Oh, and this my song through all my days. So there's no one, and there is no one else for me, none but Jesus, crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring and there is no one else for me. None but Jesus. You were crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring Him praise. Oh, I live, Lord, for You alone. All my delight and all my delight is in You, Lord. All of my hope and all of my strength and all my delight is in You, Lord, forevermore. And all my delight is in You, Lord, and all of my hope and all of my strength and all my delight is in You, Lord, forevermore. There is no one else for me. None but Jesus. Oh, You were crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring You praise.
All right, we're going to take communion together, and I'll close this in prayer. But before I do that, let me read verses 16 to 18 again. Don't be deceived, my dearly loved brothers. Every generous act and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. With Him there is no variation or shadow cast by turning. By His own choice, He gave us a new birth by the message of truth, so that we would be the first fruits of His creatures. Let's take the bread and the juice. Let me close us in prayer. Father God, our hearts are such messes. Our loves are disordered. We've put the gifts before You who gave them to us. We spend so much time being angry at You for the bad things that happen in life, and so little time being thankful for all the good things that we don't even think about, God. Your word calls us to remember that every generous act, every perfect gift, everything beautiful in this life, our lives themselves, they're a gift from You, the Father of lights. And in an unbelievable act of role reversal, You entered into the mess that we made of our lives and this life in the person and work of Your Son, Jesus, who lived the life that we could have never lived. He died the death that we should have died, and He rose again, promising that His victory would become our victory if we would simply put our trust in Him. God, please help us to be a people that love You more than we used to all throughout our lives, that hide more of our joy in You than we used to all throughout of our lives, God, that make You the source of our joy, that see behind the goodness of this life to the goodness of God, to You, to who You are, the God that we were made to know, so that we could be people that walk through trials with joy. We could walk through trials with endurance. We could walk through trials with maturity, that we would be complete and lacking nothing, both for your glory and for our joy. And we know that you'll do it in the name of your Son, Jesus. All God's people said, amen. Have a great week, Severn.